You're probably familiar with authentication, that's who the user is, but there's something that may even be more important, which is authorization. What permissions does the user have? What level of access do they get to a particular resource? So let's say your company has an expense management app like this. So currently we are logged in as Lisa. Lisa has a role of a basic standard user, and therefore Lisa can edit this expense, but not approve the expense. But what if we make Lisa a manager? A manager can approve expenses. So now we also want to show an approve button here in the UI. This is the domain of authorization, and this is the front end, but maybe you're already familiar with this from the back end side of this. Let's say it looks something like this in our app, right? We just have, let's say, a get API route and a put API route to update an expense. And I'm actually using Next.js in this video, but could be any kind of backend, whether it's an Express API or some other API, right? So then if you want to approve an expense, it would look something like this. You're going to have some kind of update to the expense. So let's say that's a put request. You would get the approved status from whatever the client submitted, and then you would actually update it into your database. And you would say the status of the expense should be whatever is coming here. Now, this is not safe. Anybody can make a request to our API route, right? So you may say, we need to make sure the user is logged in. So here's typically where you would use your identity provider, right? Could be Next.auth, could be KindAuth, Okta. These are your typical identity providers, and they will give you a user object. If there is no user, the user is not logged in, so you redirect them to login, let's say. But this is not enough, because even if the user is logged in, it doesn't mean that they can just approve expenses. Only, let's say, managers can approve expenses. So here we want to have another step, the authorization step. And typically you're going to have a bunch of if checks if you're going to do it like this. So you could maybe check for their role. So maybe that's part of the user object. You can check if they are a manager, and maybe there are other requirements as well. So the user's department needs to be the same as the department of the expense that's going to be updated. And I'm just writing some pseudocode here, so don't mind the red squiggly lines. And let's say a manager can only approve if the expense is at most, let's say $500. Right? So it will be something like this. Right? So if any of that is not true, then we're going to return something like unauthorized. And only after that is when we would actually update the database. But you can imagine that we have a lot of rules here, a lot of business logic, right? There is a maximum amount that a standard manager can approve, and then maybe a finance manager. So if the department of the user is finance, they can approve any amount, right? So you can imagine that in the real world, you have a lot of authorization logic. And right now I'm hard coding this in my app. This is a bad idea, because if you have multiple services, multiple apps, you often need the same type of logic. So I would have to duplicate this in other parts of my architecture as well. So then when you make a change, maybe something in the real world in the business has changed, and now this amount needs to become $1,000. Right? This is the back end, but we probably want to have similar logic on the front end. And maybe you have other microservices, maybe you have a mobile app, so you have multiple instances where you have similar logic. So whenever you make a change, you have to update it in all of those instances. So that is actually very error prone, and it can actually become a security issue. So we don't want to hard code this logic inside our application or services. We want to have one source of truth where we can put all of our authorization logic, and that's what Cerbos offers us. Cerbos is an open source solution. You can use it for free, and they solve that authorization problem for you. That's what we're going to use in this video. They are, of course, the sponsor, but even if they weren't sponsoring this video, I would still use them in my own SaaS product. So I'm going to show you exactly how to use Cerbos to replace this spaghetti code, and I will also link to the final code in the description in case you want to take a look at it yourself. Cerbos works on the front end as well, as we'll see in a second. Let's actually start off with the back end though. So let's come back here and let's see how we can replace this spaghetti code here with just one API call to Cerbos. So you would still do the authentication in the first step, right? So this doesn't change. You can still use your typical identity provider like Kind or Okta or Next.auth, and typically they have some kind of SDK where you can get the user info. They will give you some user object if the user is logged in. Otherwise, we can redirect, let's say. So let's say that that first step actually gives us a user object that looks like this. So Lisa is logged in and Lisa is a manager. And that's the auth and the authentication step. So to make a good authorization decision, we need to know who is making the request, but we also need something in between here, which is actually to get the resource that the user is trying to perform an action on. So we actually need to get the expense in this case. So you would do something like this, right? I'm using Prisma here, but you would get the actual resource, and in this case an expense, you would get it from the database. And let's say that we get something like this. So it has some information here, an amount, the status, and also who created the expense. The reason that we need to get our resource from the database, by the way, is because we need to make that authorization decision based on the latest data. Since the data in our database is the actual source of truth when it comes to the data, there's no way around it. We need to actually make that round trip to the database in order to make a safe authorization decision. So now we have user information and the resource information. Now we can get to this authorization step, replace this spaghetti code here with the following. So step 3 is the actual authorization check. Here I'm gonna use Cerbos. Most of the time you only need this one method here, check resource, and you're gonna pass all of that information, the user information, the expense information. You're going to pass that to Cerbos. Cerbos has the actual business logic. So the amount up until a manager can approve, that type of logic. We're going to give all of that to Cerbos, let Cerbos manage that. The only thing we have to do is just pass along all the information to Cerbos, and Cerbos will come back with a decision for us. So in this case, in this put API route, actually the action that's trying to be performed here would not be view, it would be, let's say, approve. Right? So we have a principal, this is basically just a user, and we have the resource information, and then we have the action that the principal is trying to perform on the resource. Cerbos will let us know if that's allowed or not. If that's not allowed, if decision, right, so here we get decision, if, and then we can check for the action approve. If the approve action is not allowed, we're going to return a 403 not authorized error. And only after all of those steps do we get here, the user is authorized, so we can update the database, right? But in the real world, this third step is actually often the most complicated one, especially in more sophisticated software where you have a lot of access control issues. So Cerbos actually has a great graphic on their website. So this is the architecture. So here a user is going to make some request to our backend, right? So the dashed lines here, that's our entire backend here. You may have some API gateway, but let's ignore that for now. So here we have some kind of backend application, right? So I'm using Next.js in this project, but it could be an Express web server, could be any kind of app or service here on your backend. So the user is trying to perform some action on a resource, and traditionally you would write spaghetti code directly in your application code. And there are many problems with that, especially if you have multiple services, you need to duplicate that logic, etc. So instead, we're going to use Cerbos here. The only thing that we have to do in our application code is collect the user information, collect the resource information, and that's what we're going to pass over to Cerbos here. And Cerbos will give us an allow or deny decision. But all of the business logic, and a manager can only approve up to $500, only approve if it's in the same department. That type of logic has to do with actual business requirements. We're going to extract that out from our applications, out from our services into Cerbos. Right? Cerbos is just a microservice running in your environment here. So that's how it's all structured. Now to write the business logic, we actually create a so-called policy file. Right? So then we give the policy file to that microservice. It will take the policy file that actually holds the actual business logic. It's a YAML file where we actually define all of those rules. And that microservice will just take the incoming information and evaluate those rules with that information. So if we look at our code right now, we are indeed making that call here, right? So await Cerbos, check resource, we're passing the information. So where is that business logic then? Well, that's what we need to write in a policy file, which we will then give to Cerbos. To write that policy file, we could create some file here in our IDE and write it here, all of those rules. But the people behind Cerbos now have a new offering called Cerbos Hub. One of the features is that we can log into a dashboard. And so if you make a mistake, you immediately get notified here. You can run tests, and they actually have some wonderful examples here as well. So you can find something that's close to your own use case and then just modify it. So they actually have an expense management example in their dashboard. So here you would then write your actual business logic, right? So here, for example, a user with role admin is allowed to perform any action. So then here, an updating an expense is only allowed by the owner of the resource. So this is typically the user that created the resource. They can update, they can edit. And you can see in the examples as well how granular you can get here. And so you can add all sorts of conditions here and really reflect the real world accurately in this policy file. So you would write it here, and then once you're finished, you can essentially just copy and paste it here into your IDE. So what I like to do is just create a folder here for Cerbos where I have all of that business logic. So I like to call it policies, and then in there I'm creating a file called expense.yaml. So here then I have the rules for our project here. So here, let's say a standard user can view and edit under the following condition: the resource needs to be created by that user, right? So here we saw already in step 2 where we get the actual expense, it has a created by field. So it's created by some user, and if that's the same as the user that's logged in, which is the case here, the user is allowed to view and edit. And then here a manager can view and edit and also approve all expenses, even if they didn't create it, but only up to $500. And so here's where we encode all of that business logic. And we can add many more things, like a finance manager can approve all expenses regardless of the amount. This is where you have the juicy logic essentially of authorization, right? So that's the policy file here. Now to actually use it in practice, because it's just a file, right? So some server needs to actually use that file to run that logic. So we're going to give that to Cerbos here, or what Cerbos calls a policy decision point. So this is the point where the actual authorization decision is made, just a microservice in your environment. So we need to give the policy file to Cerbos. How do we do that? Well, that's also something we can do with Cerbos Hub now. So besides these playgrounds where you can actually write your policy file, here below you also have a workspace, and this will allow you to easily push your policy file into your Cerbos policy decision points, because you can have multiple. You can scale this up or down as much as you want because it's stateless. It just takes a policy file and runs the given information through there essentially. So with Cerbos Hub, actually there's a new diagram now. I can just push this repo I have here, my code base, to GitHub, and I can connect Cerbos Hub to my GitHub repo. That's what I'm doing with this workspace here. They show you what to do. So we need to add a Cerbos Hub YAML file. So I'm gonna add that right here, and then I'm gonna just copy and paste this right here. You can add some Git logic here. We'll just keep it simple. So I'm gonna create a new repository here on GitHub so we can push our code there, and then Cerbos Hub can pick that up and it can take the policy file from there. All right, so here we just need to push. I'm just gonna add everything, and then we can just commit and push to GitHub. If I refresh now, it should be here. All right, so here I have my repo on GitHub now. Now I can go back to my workspace here. Right, so still in this screen here, I can actually connect it. They call it the policy repository because here is where I will actually have my policies. Right, so I created a Cerbos folder here in my project. So I have one nice centralized place where I have all the business logic for authorization. So then here I need to connect my GitHub account so Cerbos Hub can actually find this repository, and then in here can find those policy files. We only have one in this case. If you have different kinds of resources, you may have multiple just for organization purposes. So here I called it Cerbos YouTube. I'm going to continue here. All right, so here I'm using the main branch. Now, which directory are your policies stored? So this is actually in Cerbos/policies. So make sure you actually add the correct one, create my workspace. All right, so then you get a secret key. I'm going to copy that right here, and let me actually put that somewhere. I will actually just paste it here for a second. I'm going to say, yes, I copied this. And now I have my workspace here. All right, so then here we can actually spin up a decision point. Our decision point will be running here, and our app can send over the information and get a decision. So here we can say deploy a decision point to give you multiple options. We're just going to use a simple Docker container. This is just a command that we can run in our terminal. So I will copy that and I will paste it right here for the moment. So we do need to replace this with the actual secrets here. So here, that's the actual workspace secret that I just had. And then we also need a client ID and a secret. I can go to settings here, and here I can generate client credentials. Okay, I can just call that. And I get a client ID here. I will copy that and just paste that right there, as well as the secret. Make sure you don't share this to anyone else. All right, so this command is using Docker here. Now I already installed Docker for my desktop. This is the easiest way to get started. So on the Docker website, you will find under products, Docker desktop. So once you download it, you will see something like this. We don't need to know much about it right now, so don't worry if you're coming from a front-end background. So now I have the Docker desktop app running in the background. I can just open up my terminal and just paste this right here and actually run that script. And you can see it's starting up that Cerbos policy decision point. So this is actually some service that will take the policy file and make that actual decision. So if I log in, you can see it has a message here, bundle open. And if I go back here to my dashboard here, if I go to those decision points, you can see now there is an instance running here. Right? So what we have now is a policy decision point actually running here. This policy decision point is running that policy file that we actually added to our GitHub repo. We connected that to Cerbos Hub here. So Cerbos Hub can automatically take the policy file from there. It will actually run it through there their CI/CD pipeline. So if a test doesn't pass, or if there are any syntax issues with the policy file, it will stop right there. But if everything went all right, it will actually give it to the Cerbos policy decision point for us. Now we actually need to connect our app to that instance so we can actually pass it over, right? So we actually already had the code. I can remove this now. Let me close all of this. So here we were actually trying to make that call, but you can see we still haven't defined Cerbos here. And Cerbos doesn't exist right now. So I'm going to create a separate file here in my library. I like to call it something like Cerbos server because we can also use it on the client, as we'll see in a second. And then here I can actually connect with Cerbos. So Cerbos actually has a package that we can install from npm. We can connect to it over gRPC, which is a little bit better in certain ways than just plain HTTP. That's what we export here. So now I can actually import into this file. So now if I save here and if we run this code, we should be able to see an actual decision. So this is all for the put route. Let's actually quickly do the same for the get route. All right, so I just added all of the logic for the get route as well. And here we are using Cerbos as well. Right here in this case, it's not approval. Here it's just viewing an expense. And here I'm logging the decision that Cerbos will give us. Right, so let's actually see. Right, so I'm going to open up my terminal here. Here I have my app running. Right, so now let's see what we get. I need to hit the API route. I'm going to load this page, which will send a request to our app here, which in turn passes all of the information to that Cerbos instance, which then gives us the decision. So I just need to refresh here and it will actually hit that API route. So I'm gonna refresh here. Let's see what we get. And indeed, we get a decision here. It says true. So based on this information, Cerbos decided that it is allowed, right? So now we have a nice API here to deal with authorization. We just have to pass along the necessary information and then Cerbos will actually make the decision based on the policy file, right? So it looks a little bit complicated, but it all makes sense when you think about it. We can now just make a call to that Cerbos instance whenever we need some kind of authorization decision. That Cerbos instance is just making the decision according to the policy that we wrote. Here is where we actually have all the business logic. We can include it as part of our Git repository. So then whenever we make a change, which is very common actually, and this is usually where you run into an issue, because now let's say we actually do need to make a change, right? So here the business requirements have changed. Now managers can approve up to $1,000, right? So traditionally, if you had this in multiple places in your architecture, you would have a problem right now. But I have centralized all of this logic in my policy file here. So if I just save here, the only thing I need to do is just push to GitHub. And since I connected Cerbos Hub to my Git repository, Cerbos Hub will automatically pull out the latest policy file, will run it through their CI/CD pipeline. If everything went all right, they will push it to that policy decision point. So then we can just keep making calls to that decision point. It will automatically be updated for us. So I just changed this. Now I can just push this to GitHub again. So here I'm just gonna push to GitHub, git push origin main. All right, so I just pushed here. Let's actually see what happens here in the terminal. Let's see if we get, so here you can see we get an update here. You can see it says bundle opened again, right? So what happens here is we push to GitHub, Cerbos Hub picks up on that, and then it will push that to our policy decision points. And that's why we get another bundle opened here. So now all the requests will be evaluated according to the latest policy. All right, so that's all back end. Now, what about the front end? Because in the real world, if we go back to our example, we often want to render a different UI depending on the permissions that the user has, right? So a manager, for example, should be able to approve this. So here we want to render an approve button. So with Cerbos Hub, we can actually also use the exact same policy file with the same business logic as what we use on the server on the front end, because Cerbos Hub will take that policy file and also create a WebAssembly module from that, which we can then include in the browser. So you can get that WebAssembly module in here as well. So here you can see it's called embedded. So here you can see we get a URL for that. And this is what we can use to run authorization logic on the front end, which is helpful for changing the UI depending on the permissions that the user has. So let's say we have that page here. I'm using Next.js. So Next.js has both a backend as well as a front end. So here I have two states here for whether the user can edit or approve. And so here we need to run some logic to see if the user can actually edit or approve it. So by default it's false, but maybe the user is allowed to edit or approve it. So we need to run the logic. And as you'll see, it's actually the same as on the backend. So the first step is your authentication check. And so typically your identity provider like Kind or Next auth or Okta will give you some kind of hook in React that you can use on the client here to get the actual user information. So let's say we get something like this. We get Lisa here. Lisa is a manager. All right, so step 2, we've seen it before, get the resource info. So you need to get the resource info. So here in this case, we would fetch it from our backend, let's say, and that's what we will store in state here as well. So now we have user information and resource information. That's what we can then pass to Cerbos. Cerbos will make the decision. But on the front end, it's going to be based on the WebAssembly module. So here we have our authorization check. So here, let's see, we are using useEffect here because it's basically like an external system. So here we can do cerbos.checkResource, the exact same API call, pass along all the necessary information, and Cerbos will take care of the actual decision. Right, so here we get an actual decision. So if the user is allowed to edit, we're going to change the state. Now here you can see I get a red squiggly line here. So we do need to connect to Cerbos here on the front end as well. So we have Cerbos server, but now we also have Cerbos browser. Right, so here you can also get this from npm. Here it's not gRPC, we're just using fetch here, and you need to specify the URL here that you get under embedded here in the dashboard. All right, so then we can import the Cerbos here, so we can use that here. Oh, we do need to make sure we get the right one. If I now save and we go back here, you can see Lisa as a manager. So Lisa is indeed allowed to both edit as well as approve this expense. So now we have correctly changed the UI. Now what if I change Lisa instead of a manager? Maybe she is just a standard user. So here, instead of manager, we're going to make Lisa a basic user. And now you can see when I go back, the approval button is gone because a basic user cannot approve expenses. Only managers can. But a basic user can still edit an expense if they created it. So in this case, the expense was created by Lisa, so we are indeed correctly rendering an edit button here. You can see it's a bit messy here in the component, so we can even create a custom hook here for Cerbos to make all of these authorization decisions on the client. We can call that hook useCerbos, and we just pass in the necessary information. So then here to use it, we could do something like this. Use useCerbos. To get the user, you would have your React hook from your identity provider. For the expense, you will probably have some custom hook for data fetching as well. And then the action you want to check for here would be approve, let's say. And then here you get the actual decision. So then you wouldn't have to have a separate use state for approve here. So now we're using Cerbos on both the back end as well as on the front end. And the real power is that now, whenever you make a change in your business, there's a business requirement change. Managers can now approve up to $5,000, let's say. We only have to change it in one place, which is in that policy file. This is our single source of truth for all of our business logic. I only have to make a change here. Now it's $5,000. I only have to push it then to GitHub, git push origin. I'm pushing it to GitHub. And since I connected Cerbos Hub to there, Cerbos Hub is connected to my GitHub repo. So whenever I update this and the new policy file is being pushed here, Cerbos Hub automatically detects that, runs it through their CI/CD pipeline, runs tests, and if it succeeds, will automatically distribute it to all of my Cerbos instances, whether it's on the back end, front end. We don't have to change the URL of the WebAssembly module. The updated one will automatically be served from the same URL. So my entire portfolio of services and apps is updated with the latest authorization logic, all managed for me by Cerbos Hub. So really powerful solution for authorization. I would say check it out. You can find a link in the description. Thanks for watching this video.